everyone. We have a wonderful guest on today, Rabbi Steve Leder. He was twice named by Newsweek magazine as one of the 10 most influential rabbis in America. He is the senior rabbi of Wilshire Boulevard Temple in Los Angeles, serving over 2,400 families at 3 campuses. He is also the author of such critically acclaimed books as The Extraordinary Nature of Ordinary Things, More Money Than God, Living a Rich Life Without Losing Your Soul. Definitely want to have him on to talk about that. And More Beautiful Than Before, How Suffering Transforms Us. He's been on so many shows, an often commentator on NPR, ABC, PBS, Fox, CBS This Morning. It's endless. So please enjoy our really wonderful discussion that we had today about what suffering can mean in your life and the lives of others.
I'm not the house of cards that falls down easily. Oh, I'm strong enough to handle what you throw at me.
Welcome to Mental Health News Radio. I'm your host, Kristen Sunanta Walker. Just what are we going to discuss? The intimacy that is mental health. Let's continue to make it as comfortable as discussing brain health or heart health. This show has been on the air for several years, and we have amazing co-hosts. And then we created a network of podcasters on mentalhealthnewsradionetwork.com, a place where every possible facet of mental well-being can be talked about openly. My show, after several hundred interviews, the format is this: intimate, deep, funny, touching, sometimes uncomfortable, but always vulnerable conversations with interesting people. The goal is to have you, our listening family, many of you who have become my good friends, feel as though you are listening in on private conversations. Thank you for tuning in and becoming part of this amazing journey with me, and now with our network of podcasters. Just knowing this podcast might be helping any of you realize you are not alone on this journey called being a human being makes doing this podcast worth every second.
After all we promised, we'd be cordial.
Steve, thank you so much for coming on my show.
I'm happy to be with you today.
Yeah, so we have a mutual friend who's introduced me to a lot of wonderful people, Dr. Mark Goulston.
Yes. He's an amazing guy, and he does very important work. He helps a lot of people who suffer.
Yes, he absolutely does. I love what we're going to talk about today, especially with what's going on in the United States right now with all of the mass violence and the shootings. So talking about your book, More Beautiful Than Before, How Suffering Transforms Us, is timely.
Yeah, unfortunately timely, but it is.
Yeah.
And, to be honest with you, it's timely not just because of national events, but because everyone hurts. To be human is sooner or later to suffer. So it's a timeless book in that way.
Yes, absolutely. So talk about, the impetus for writing this particular book.
This book is, in a sense, a kind of apology. It's my written apology to not only members of my congregation, but to so many others that I tried to help over my first 27 years as a rabbi and as a writer. So for the first 27 years of my career, I spent an awful lot of time counseling and helping people who are suffering, going through very difficult things. And as you know, Kristen, there are many forms of suffering. There are many forms of hell, right? There's the hell of loss, the hell of addiction, the hell of a kid in trouble, the hell of divorce, the hell of chronic pain, the hell of depression. There are many, many, many kinds of hell. And I always said to people, if you're going to walk through hell, don't come out empty-handed. And I did my best to help people come out of their personal hell with something meaningful. But then after 27 years of that, which was 5 years ago now, something happened to me, and I experienced brutalizing pain. And then I realized that despite my best efforts over those 27 years of helping other people through pain, that I actually knew very little about pain, almost nothing, until I experienced it myself. And that much of what I had said to others to help them prior to this experience was, frankly, pretty shallow. So I wrote this book as a kind of apology to all of those people, and as a way of saying, now I understand. Now I understand you better. I understand myself better. I understand what it means to come out the other end of pain in a much deeper way. Now, the book is not about me. I would say it's about 5%, 10% about me, 90% about the journey so many others have taken through all forms of pain and coming out the other side of it. The book is divided into 3 sections: surviving, healing, and growing, which for me is the trajectory, the ideal trajectory of pain. First, you have to survive it. Then you have to heal. And then you have the opportunity to grow.
Right.
Now, what happened in my specific case was 5 years ago, I was in a very frightening car accident. And to make a long story short, it resulted in just unbearable, searing physical pain because of what happened to my spinal cord. And, I had never felt or experienced anything like it. And that led to a series of failed treatments. It led to opioids and steroids and more opioids and more steroids and more opioids and more steroids, and then surgery and then more opioids and depression. And it took me a long time to get my arms around it, despite my many years of helping others through pain and my own, fairly deep spiritual mooring and foundation. So that's the backstory of the book. And, fortunately, it seems to be helping, tens of thousands of people.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's achieving its mission.
I think it's so interesting when you were saying, the pain of divorce, the pain, the hell of a kid in trouble, all those things. I thought, the hell of just being a human being.
Of course, sooner, to quote the great sage Bob Marley, he said, when the rain falls, it don't fall on one man's house. We all get rained on, all of us.
Yeah, we do.
And we all suffer things. And here's sort of the theological point. We all suffer things we don't deserve. Terrible things happen to good people all the time.
Right.
And that requires a kind of spiritual, soulful reckoning that is very difficult, but absolutely achievable.
What do you say to people who, blame themselves, spend an inordinate amount of time? Well, what's inordinate? Everybody's journey is different, but that really spend a lot of time berating themselves that this was their fault. They've been a bad person, and so this is why this has happened.
Well, sometimes that's true.
Right.
And that's a very important step, in the process of healing and growing from pain. Owning it. Own it if it's on you. And get as much as you can out of the experience and then move on. But I think owning one's own responsibility for one's own circumstances when it is accurate and true is extremely important. Don't position yourself as the victim when in fact you're the perpetrator.
Yeah, that's
now,
interesting.
I think listen, 12-step programs are based on this for addiction. You have to own, you have to do what's called a fearless inventory, right? Mm-hmm. Take a fearless inventory of how your behavior has hurt others, the things for which you are responsible, right? Now, one of the things, by the way, that I talk about in the book, look, I didn't create a genre here. There are many books about pain and suffering. I hope and believe mine is a different kind of book. But one of the things my book talks about that I did not see elsewhere when I researched the genre before writing is, what about when you're the cause of the pain? What about when you've hurt another? That's its own special kind of pain. Right. To know that you've embarrassed your child or hurt your family or hurt another human being through your own narcissism or carelessness or ego. What then? How does one find one's way back after that? And I actually, in one chapter in the book called Hurt and Run, I actually lay out 4 sort of steps for people to go through if you've hurt another. And that if you do actually walk those 4 difficult and important steps, you deserve to be forgiven. I don't really believe forgiveness is just granted. I think it has to be earned. It can be earned, right? So, so the first half of my answer to your question is, well, sometimes people are responsible for their own pain and the pain they've caused others, and you need to walk these steps and own it, and then learn what you can from it, and then move forward. Okay. I mean, guilt, by the way, does tell us that you're a good human being, right? It's the person who has no shame and has no guilt. That's a dangerous person, right?
Yes, and we've done many, many shows on that, and I always get that's the most downloaded topic is actually people that have like narcissistic personality disorder, as an example, and they're just their whole life is spent hurting others, and they have no shame, no guilt,
Right. Now, was that person victimized at some point early on in his or her life? Probably.
Right.
So we can sometimes explain it, but not necessarily excuse it. Now, to get to your question, sort of the bulk of your question, the meat of the question, what about when the innocent suffer? Then what? Right? First of all, I think saying to someone, I have found in my counseling, my spiritual counseling with people, when they do come in and say, I'm a good person, why is God doing this to me? The first thing I say to them is, God isn't doing this to you. I don't believe in that kind of God who picks and chooses, who suffers and who doesn't. I don't think God has anything to do with the suffering of the innocent. And you can almost see the cloud lift just with that simple insight, right? Because they're operating in the world with a pediatric theology. The only thing a 5-year-old can imagine is a God who's a kind of parental figure in the sky who metes out reward and punishment. A kind of Santa Claus God, knows if you've been good or,
right.
knows if you've been bad or nice, right? But that's a very pediatric view, theological point of view, and it doesn't hold up very well when bad things happen to good people, especially when you're the person it's happened to. So the first thing I think we need to do is remove sort of God from the picture in that scenario, because I'm not a fundamentalist. The second thing I try to do is move people off of the why question, because it's the wrong question. Why did this happen to me? I'm a good person. It's the wrong question because there's no answer to that question.
Right.
It's a cul-de-sac. It's a dead end, and you go around and around and around. So I try to move people as gently but clearly and quickly as possible from the why question to the what and the how. What, given that this has happened, am I going to do about it and about my life? How am I going to live my life going forward, given that this happened to me? And, let me be clear about the book and my own point of view. In no way is this a kind of idealization of suffering. I am not here to tell you that suffering isn't really suffering. It's just a step on the path to enlightenment, etc.
Right.
I think suffering is suffering and pain is pain, and I don't have anything good to say about it. We all wish we never had to enter this club of those who suffered. But as I said earlier, if you're going to go through hell, and we all do, don't come out empty-handed. So I'm not here telling you, Kristen, that this kind of suffering is worth it, but I am here to say neither is it worthless.
Mm.
There is always something formative and powerful to be learned from pain, because pain is really, frankly, the great teacher. We don't learn very much from success. It doesn't teach us very much, except to keep doing the same thing over and over and over again.
Right.
It's pain that disrupts our lives and our souls and our hearts. It's pain that wakes us up. It's pain that presents us with an invitation to change our lives.
And how people react to it, you being the one in pain is very telling. People can hurt other people, and they've told themselves a story about how they didn't hurt anyone. It's that other person's fault. They deserved it, whatever. And, you have to figure out how to navigate through that when you know that this person did hurt you, or this event did hurt you. And sometimes the people in your life that are around you at the time are going to treat you like you have pain and suffering cooties that they're going to catch.
Yes. Well, let me, yes. By the way, people with cancer feel this all the time. They walk into the room and people move away from them.
Mm-hmm.
Look, here's the way I address that issue. I'm going to put it pretty glibly, but I think also perfectly. And I say this in the book. One of the first things I say to people when they come to see me in pain is, you're about to find out who your friends are and who they are not. And when you are in pain and when you are suffering, it strips away a lot of nonsense in your life. It clears out an awful lot of underbrush. And what I tell people is, when you are suffering and you're in pain, even if you've caused it even if you're the cause of your own pain, let's say you've done something shameful or stupid and destroyed your reputation and embarrassed your family, etc. What I say to people is, the people in your life who really matter don't mind. And the people who mind, they don't matter.
Right.
When you're suffering, the people who show up, they really matter. And the people who don't show up, move on, forget them. They weren't your friends.
How about if that's your family?
Well, even if it's your family, you really find out what family means when you're in trouble.
Yes.
Family is a kind of a porous term, right? And we can have friends who are family, we can have family who are friends, but you really find out when you're in trouble who matters and who doesn't. And sometimes, by the way, you will be disappointed and you will be pleasantly surprised.
Mm-hmm. What would you say to people who, they're going through something, whether it's their fault, partially their fault, not their fault, and the people in their life are just saying things that are so hurtful or, acting like they have cooties? How do you counsel someone to deal with that, to put up boundaries around that when they're already in a pretty weakened state?
Right. Okay, well, if you don't mind, let's flip the question and
Sure.
Let's look at it from the other direction. How do we counsel people who have a family member or friend? What do we say to them about showing up? Right? What are the do's and don'ts? And I talk about this in the book. There's a chapter all about showing up, right? So let's start with this. First, there are 7 words you should never say to someone who's suffering. Never say these 7 words. Let me know if you need anything. That is the worst thing you can say to someone who's suffering. First of all, most people who say it don't mean it, right? Secondly, even if you do mean it, you've now given homework to a person who is already carrying a terribly burdensome weight. And now you're giving that person homework to tell you what he or she needs. So don't say that. Be proactive. Just ask yourself, if I were in his or her situation, what would be helpful? And then do it. Don't wait to be asked. Whether it's a hot meal dropped off at the doorstep, carpooling for the kids, play dates for the kids, going to the doctor's appointment to take notes, whatever it might be, anticipate the need and meet it. Don't wait to be told or asked. So that's the first thing. Don't say to someone who's suffering, let me know if you need anything. Act, right? Number 2, you don't have to know what to say. After 32 years of being a rabbi and visiting the homes of mourners and visiting hospital rooms and visiting nursing homes, when I'm out there in the hallway before I walk into that hospital room, Chris, I still don't know what I'm going to say after all these years. I just know I need to walk through that door.
Hmm.
And the rest will unfold. If I show up with my humanity and an open heart and the ability to listen, the right thing will happen. So that's the next thing. You don't need a plan when you're reaching out to someone who's suffering. The pure human act of reaching out means so much. And all of us who suffered know this. We know who called. We know who sent a card. We know who dropped off a meal. And we know who disappeared, right?
Right.
Now, to the earlier part of your question, or your actual question, which is, what about those of us who are suffering? So there's a beautiful saying in the Talmud, very powerful idea. The sages of the Talmud said the following: the prisoner cannot free himself. The prisoner cannot free himself. None of us, I don't care who you are, no human being suffers pain better alone. None of us. Because the most painful part of pain is the feeling of isolation, that you're in it alone, that nobody really understands. Now, when you're suffering, find the courage and the strength to reach out. Help. I need you. I'm lost. I'm confused. I'm alone. I'm in the dark. It hurts. Help. Reach out. Because when you reach out, others will reach back and they will help lift you from your suffering. That's a promise. But if you try to go it alone, stoically, the pain is exponentially greater. The next thing I would say to the person who's suffering is avoid, as much as possible, catastrophizing the future. You know, I did a lot of research on chronic pain, physical pain, before I wrote this book, and it's a fact that two patients with the identical condition, one who catastrophizes the future, this is never going to get better, this is the end of my happiness forever, et cetera, that person suffers the pain much more intensely than a person with the identical affliction, the identical disease, the identical diagnosis, who catastrophizes less and instead changes that inner dialogue from, for example, I'll never feel well again, to something more akin to, it waxes and it wanes. Or the person who says, I'll never be able to play tennis again, to a person who says, I'll do new and different things because of this. So if you can avoid catastrophizing the future as much as possible, look, we're all human and we tend to think the worst. But if you can reduce your catastrophizing of the future even 10%, it makes a very powerful change in the way in which you survive and heal from any kind of pain. So those are a couple of very important things. The final thing I would say to you when someone comes to me who is, facing something terribly painful, I always ask, or almost always ask, prior to this, what is the most difficult thing you ever got through in your life? And they always know what it is very quickly. For example, they might say something like, well, it was the death of my mother. I was 15 and it was terrible. And then I'll ask, how did you get through that? And then the person will generally think about it for a moment or two and say, for example, something like, well, I really leaned on my family. I leaned on my friends. Time helped. I sought therapy. Whatever it is, they found a way to get through that earlier trauma. And I remind the person that those opportunities, those mechanisms, those coping mechanisms, both internal and external, exist for them now as well. And that if they got through that earlier event, they will also get through this, and they will get through it the same way they got through it the last time. In other words, you're basically saying to people who feel like they are in new territory, no, it's not as new as you think. You actually know how to do this. And that's a very powerful reframing of their current circumstance.
Yes, absolutely it is. I lived with my ex-husband, who's a very good friend of mine, chronic pain, opioid addiction, that he started taking, in high school to play football and all that. So, he had all those things happen with him, and still lives with chronic pain. And it is so difficult, because that this person is in chronic pain, and their ability to have patience is not there.
Yes, yes, it's exhausting, and it shortens your patience. It increases your temper. But look, I'm not asking for anything more than 10% is what I would say to you, right? 10%, catastrophizing 10% less, changing the internal dialogue to be 10% more positive than it was heretofore. These make colossal differences.
What about someone coming to you and, they really haven't had a, religious background or any kind of a spiritual life, and they come at this, and this is the thing that makes them take a different look at their life, but they are lost in the weeds because they don't have any kind of background to pull from?
Well, look, I haven't met a person yet who doesn't believe in something. They may have difficulty with the word God because it carries with it a lot of associations that they disagree with. Often people come to see me and say, I don't believe in God. And I just say, that's okay. What do you believe in?
Right.
And they always go on to articulate some very deep spiritual point of view. They might say, I believe in humankind, or I believe in the power of nature, or I believe in the cosmos, whatever it is. They're just substituting a different word for what many people mean when they say God. There is no human beings believes that he or she is responsible for the sunrise and the sunset and the pattern of the stars in the sky. We all know there's something greater at work in the universe than any single individual. And so I try again to start to look at what people do believe in instead of what they don't believe in.
Gotcha.
Someone who comes to me and says, look, I have no faith. I say, well, what do you believe in? I mean, do you believe the sun's going to rise tomorrow? And they'll say, well, of course. And I'll say, well, you accept that on faith then, right? And I use the word very deliberately. I mean, you do have faith. It may not be faith in the kind of God you hear about on television or read about in, certain parts of the Bible, but you are a person of faith. I mean, you do believe in something powerful beyond yourself. And so let's not worry about what we call that. Let's talk about how your faith in that. So, for example, the sunrise view. Let's talk about how your faith that light follows darkness. Let's talk about how that might help you as you go through this. Right? And so that's the approach in my view.
Mm. How about the patience that's needed? Sometimes, someone can hurt you because their age or their personality disorder or whatever, whatever the reason is. And, you hope that they're going to get it one day, because not that you want some sort of, and I don't mean get it as in they get it, even though sometimes you do think that, but I mean, someday you hope that they're going to wake up, not to give you some sort of appeasement, but because that's going to be transforming for them. And then, sitting with the patience of, you probably will never see if they do.
Yeah.
That can be difficult.
Well, it can, but at a certain, look, I'll tell you a little secret. I keep a red bowl on the coffee table in my office in front of what I call my couch of tears, quoting the psalmist, this couch where people come to sit and weep. And sometimes I point to that. By the way, the bowl serves two functions. One is to hold all the tissues from all that weeping. But I also have it there because sometimes I point to that bowl and I say, you see this bowl? You could sit and cry and hope and pray and be angry for this bowl someday to become a spoon. You could talk to this bowl all day long and ask it to become a spoon for days, weeks, months, years, decades. And at a certain point, you're the fool, not the bowl. And you need to decide how you're going to live your life, not how you're going to change this other person's life.
Right.
And this is true even in the case of death. I sometimes have people come and sit with me and say, I've had a terrible relationship with my father my whole life. He was just diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He's been given 6 months to live. And, I'm going to go see him, and I'm sure that this is going to give us closure. And I have to look at that person, Kristen, and I have to say, the odds are that's not true.
Right.
Because people tend to die exactly the way they live. And I have to manage expectations. Most people don't change very dramatically over the course of their lives. Now, I'm not telling you it doesn't happen, but it's rare. And when you are unhappy with a situation, it is much more likely that you're going to be able to change yourself than change that other person. How do you see this? What are your expectations? Can you approach this other person's dysfunction and anger with some degree of empathy or sensitivity? But the idea of really changing another human being that fundamentally, it rarely happens.
Right.
And knowing that is in its own way comforting and liberating.
Right. I had to learn too. I was raised to be certain family members' protector, and every partner that they've ever had becomes their protector. They sort of abdicate all their, their what they think, what they say, all that to other people, which is very unfair. But I had to learn that, okay, I can't change them. I do have to work on how I respond to this. Their behavior and maybe not be around it. And it's also not my responsibility to save other people from their behavior either.
That's right. And nor can you.
Right.
It's a messiah complex that a lot of people have, but messiahs are pretty rare.
Yeah, I had the complex for quite a while. Don't have it anymore.
Yeah. And it's liberating, right? Isn't it liberating once you realize that this is mostly futile, if not entirely futile? And in a way, it's sort of I find it to be very liberating to make peace with what one cannot change. It's very important.
I think it's important too to acknowledge those very human feelings of wanting to do that, of wanting to warn people, of wanting to step in. And we're not talking about, of course, if someone's going to do something illegal, step in, but just immoral behavior, that kind of thing. You have to, I had to allow myself to feel angry, to feel like I wanted to go get revenge, to feel all those feelings, because I would stuff them down and that would turn into other problems for me. So wallow in it for, as you need to.
Yes. And, look, sometimes other people, often, in fact, can teach us how not to behave.
Yeah.
Aren't we all better parents because of the mistakes our parents made?
Yes.
I mean, we of course make our own mistakes going forward, but so much I think of parenting is trying not to replicate the dysfunction and the mistakes of the previous generation. We make our own, but at least we move in the right direction in terms of improvement. And that's not about changing your past or changing your parents. It is about changing yourself and how you choose to live going forward.
I wanted to ask you about this. There's a lot of mentality out there that is a victim shaming mentality, and there's a lot of debate about what that means and so on. It takes a while to get it, to really get what it means, and once you do, you cannot make other people not do that. And what I want to have a spotlight shined on is, where does that kind of a mentality come from? Where you are blame the victim person, where that's your first reaction to. I'll give you an example to give them more context. So someone has their child pass away, and people will sometimes blame that person. Well, they didn't live their life the right way. They didn't take care of their child. They didn't. Nothing that's helpful to this person. It's very much victim blaming. And I wonder about the psychology or the spirituality around the need to blame.
Yes. Well, look, it's, I think, even subconsciously a way of protecting ourselves from the fear of the same thing happening to us or someone we love.
Yes.
We have to differentiate ourselves from the victim so that we believe we're protecting ourselves from becoming that victim at some future point, right? Well, that happened to this family because they're this way and I'm not this way, and therefore that would never happen to me. All right. Now, let's talk about one of the most powerful things about pain and how it can ennoble us going forward. And it's related to your very sophisticated question. So in the Bible, in the book of Deuteronomy, it says that God puts God's words upon our hearts. Now the sages ask a very interesting question. Why does it say upon our hearts and not in our hearts? Surely if God has the power to put words upon our hearts, God would have the power to put words in our hearts. Why is it upon our hearts? And here's the answer the sages give. They say that God places words upon our hearts, and it isn't until our hearts are broken that the words can enter. When you suffer pain and you find a way through it by reaching out, being reached out to, and all of the other things that, I talk about in this book, your capacity for empathy is profoundly deeper and more powerful. And you stop victim blaming and you start reaching out with much, much greater sensitivity and care and decency and kindness. Because you have been there, you do understand, and you know that it's no one's fault, right? So the people who do victim blame, I believe, have yet to really suffer pain in a deep way. Because once you do, you react with empathy toward other fellow sufferers, not disdain and not shame. So I guess what I would say is that that this victim shaming is really a sign of immaturity more than anything else. I have a friend whose 30-year-old son committed suicide. And one of the things he said to me that bothered him the most was when people would say to him, his name was Ronnie, I can't imagine what you're going through. And this angered him because he knew every parent imagines this. Every parent has imagined his or her child dying. The first time the garage door doesn't open after you hand the car keys over, right? Or the first time you can't find your kid and they're away at college or whatever, right? The first time your kid, ran across the street unattended. We've all imagined this. So what is this? I can't imagine how you're feeling. All that is a way of distancing yourself and protecting yourself from the experience. That's not empathy.
Right.
It's the opposite. It's the opposite, right? So I think the victim shaming comes from essentially immaturity and a lack of empathy. And this is the behavior of a person. Yeah, this is the behavior of a person. Yeah, yes, and this is the behavior of a person who, frankly, hasn't suffered.
So,
Dostoevsky said his greatest fear was that his life would not be worthy of his suffering. That's so profound, so powerful. Can you lead a life worthy of the suffering you have endured? And one of the most worthy things we can do after we have survived a painful experience is to show up for others who are also suffering, who are where we have been, and to show up with a full and open heart, not judgment.
Right. And it's hard. I think about, I've done, 8 years of shows on different facets of mental health. And I think about my early shows and the amount of judgment I had when I was in pain over some narcissist or another. And I don't look at that and think, oh, I'm a bad person, but I look at it and go, okay, that's where I was at that point in my life.
Well, remember how we started this conversation. What was the point of this book? It was my effort to correct the record. It was my apology for my less mature responses and answers to these questions about pain and suffering. Exactly right. I can forgive myself for being young and naive, and but when that car accident happened and I had that spinal surgery and I was addicted to those opioids and I was depressed, And I know what it took from myself and others to overcome it all. It changed me for the better. And no, it wasn't worth it. I wish it never happened. You know, I had a friend named Paul Miller who had 3 different forms of cancer. And the 3rd cancer was lethal. I remember visiting him in the hospital when he was dying of the 3rd cancer, and he looked up at me and he said, you know, Steve, this much character I don't need. Right? So isn't that great? I wish these things didn't happen, but given that they do, can you be worthy of it going forward? Mm. Can you be a more beautiful, kinder, gentler human being as a result of it? That's the question.
Do you think that this also stems from, especially Western society, where we really look at people as one-dimensional beings, especially with social media and celebritizing and things like that? And I see people that I'll be sitting with, and I can tell that they're so excited about who I've interviewed. Oh my gosh, you interviewed that person. Oh, because they're a celebrity or whatever. And I happen to know that person personally, and they are the most messed up person, just like anybody else. But
yes. I often say pretty from afar, but far from pretty.
Yeah. And they would say that. I mean, my friends would say that too. I mean, one of them calls me and, you know, she's such a good friend that I would never say to her, look at your life. What do you have to be upset about? Because this is her experience, and I know what she's been through that the public doesn't know. But it's fascinating to me, this naivete or this magical thinking that comes along with this celebrity stuff, or this your life, you're rich, or you're whatever it is. And it's
so
people don't want to let go.
You and I, given what we do, we have the advantage, and I do mean advantage, of seeing the insides of people's lives. Mm-hmm. And, you know, there's a very old fable about, a small village, and everyone's asked to bring their suitcase full of troubles to the town square and put it in the town square. And then everyone else gets a week to look through everyone's suitcases. And then you get to choose the suitcase you're going to go home with. Mm-hmm. And everyone goes home with their own suitcase. Meaning, if you really, really are on the inside of another person's life, you wouldn't trade.
Right.
None of us would trade. Now, what is the flip side of that can be really powerful and change your life? The flip side of that is gratitude. You know, it's very hard to be depressed if you're grateful.
Right.
And you know, this Instagram nature of life now causes us to sort of lose a sense of gratitude for our own blessed lives and what we have despite our pain.
Absolutely.
There's a very famous Soviet psychiatrist named Zerganik, Bluma Zerganik, and she did a study. I'm going to overly simplify this study. She showed a number of subjects a picture of a circle with a small wedge cut out of it and tracked their eyes. And everyone's eyes go to the missing piece every time, and they miss the larger whole. And this, unfortunately, is life sometimes. We're so focused on what's missing, this missing piece, that we miss the much greater whole. This happens to me when I meet with families for funerals. They'll say to me, oh, Rabbi, in 3 more weeks, he would have been 90. Oh, Rabbi, in 2 more months, they would have been married 65 years. As if 89, years and 49 weeks isn't a great accomplishment. As if 64 years and 10 months of marriage isn't a beautiful blessing.
Right.
We sometimes miss the blessings that we have. We really don't demonstrate a lot of gratitude. And I think if you can focus and work hard at being a more grateful person. By the way, for me, this is where prayer helps. I don't believe in asking prayers. When I pray, I'm not asking for anything. I'm expressing gratitude, right? For something as simple as a piece of bread or the fact that I drew breath for another morning, right? I'll pray to get rid of things, not for things. I'll pray to get rid of pettiness, to get rid of gossip, to get rid of jealousy, right? To get rid of my narcissism, to get rid of my, ego. So prayer is a great aid in gratitude. Meditation can be a great aid. Saying thank you is gratitude. Can you say thank you 100 times a day? It'll change your life.
Yes, it does. It does. A friend of mine that comes on the show, Adam Klugman, he and I set our alarms to go off at the same time every day. And it's just to sit even for 30 seconds or less and go, I receive, I'm blessed, I'm grateful for my life. And then, go on, just stopping for a moment to say that, because we get so caught up.
Yes, and it makes you far less envious of others.
Mm-hmm.
Because not everyone gets to be on the inside of people's lives the way you and I do.
Right.
Which almost definitionally makes you grateful for your own life.
Yes.
I thank God every day for my own boring life, when I see what some people go through. But I think that these are the two sides of the issue you've raised. One is really no one has it any better than you do. No one. There's another beautiful fable I say. The book deals with grief, it's been very helpful to the grief community. I sort of track what categories in Amazon it's doing well in, and grief has been one off and on over the past couple of years since it's been out. And there's a little story in the book about a man who goes to see a healer to get help with his grief. And the healer says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go around the village, knock on every door. Here's a recipe for a cake. I want you to get one ingredient from each house. The only rule is it must be a house which has never been touched by death or grief. So the man goes out, knocks on doors, comes back at the end of the day without a single ingredient, because he couldn't find a single home where death or grief, had not at some point visited. And oddly, despite having failed in the mission, he felt better.
Right.
Now, most people think, he felt better because he knew he wasn't alone in his suffering. Everyone has suffered. I don't think that's it. I think it's more nuanced than that. I think it was the conversations that took place in those doorsteps, right? I think it was, have you been visited by grief? We have. Here's what happened.
Yeah.
It was the human connection and the conversations about grief and suffering. It was the piercing of that isolation and feeling of abandonment, right? So these kinds of things open us in ways that can profoundly change our lives for the better. And yet again, we wish they'd never happened.
Right. A healer that I work with, she would never call herself a shaman, but she definitely is one, said to me not too long ago, I'm just glad that you're in the muck with me. Those are the people I want to have around me. I don't want everything's rosy and we always have to be positive and la, la, la. I want people that are going to get in the muck. And I was like,
I agree. Wow. People that haven't suffered, they're not very interesting to me.
No, they're not.
They're not. They don't have much to say.
They start to become interesting as they have really crappy things happen to them that you feel awful for them, but they become a much more interesting, rich, evolved.
Yes. In a way, now here's what we're saying, which is paradoxical but true. In a way, we are more whole when we're broken.
Yes.
And that's the power of pain and transformation.
Well, we could have 80,000 more conversations.
Yes, we could. It is endless. Yes.
I want to make sure that listeners know you can go to Steve, STEVE, Leder, LEDER.com to find out more information on all of the books that you've written, which are tremendous. Yes. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for the work you're doing, and it's been an honor, truly an honor to speak with you today.
Same here. I'm grateful.
As am I.
Thank you, listeners, for tuning into another episode of Mental Health News Radio.
I know, no one likes commercials, but seriously, folks, without the help from these organizations, we could not stay on the air. Please give a shout out to zencharts.com. If you're a mental health or addiction treatment center, you'll want to use their EHR. It's gorgeous, and they're just good people. And also MyGenetics, MyGenetx.com, because knowing your genetic code empowers your mental health treatment. And lastly, CopeNotes.com. We love getting positive messages right to our phones every day from Johnny Crowder. He's the lead singer of Prison, a heavy metal band sharing their music about suicide prevention, addiction recovery, and mental health. See, that was painless. Support them as they support us. Back to the show.
Sometimes I'm passive aggressive, but never without good intentions. I heat up and act on my emotions.
Thanks so much for listening to Mental Health News Radio. Our podcast can be found on iTunes, Stitcher, and hundreds of other podcast apps, or you can visit our website at mentalhealthnewsradio.com. If you have a question or would like to be a guest, become a podcaster on our network, or join the amazing organizations that help keep us on the air, please email us at info@mhnrnetwork.com. Get ready for that special goodbye from our resident therapy dog, Miles, and a special thanks to Emily Sohn for letting us use her incredible song, Cordial, for our podcast music. Listen to the full song on SoundCloud at emily.sonne.
Don't be surprised when I don't hate on you. After all, we promised we'd be cordial.